I've always been intrigued by the various names that the feast day on February 2nd has, which suggest how complicated it is. The purification of the Blessed Virgin Mary, the presentation of Jesus in the temple, the meeting of Christ with Simeon, Candlemas, and of course, Groundhog Day. Groundhog Day originated as a pre-Christian feast. The date falls halfway between the winter solstice and the spring equinox. And in southern parts of Europe and milder climates in the British Isles, it was time to anticipate the coming of spring, to celebrate the return of the sun. It was an agricultural festival. It was time to begin to prepare the fields for planting. And the weather on that day, which included the issue of whether a badger or a hedgehog could see its shadow when it emerged from its burrow, enabled the farmers to predict when winter would end. And this became a folk belief in England well into medieval times and later. And there were lots of little seasonal rhymes in English that suggest this. If Candlemas Day is bright and clear, there'll be 2 winters in the year. If Candlemas be fair and bright, winter will have another bite. So that's how they knew whether it was safe to plant their crops or not. The same date, 40 days after Christmas, 40 days after the birth of Jesus, marks the day when Mary, as an observant Jewish mother, was required to present herself and her child at the temple. For her to be purified after the birth of a male child, the Jewish mother was considered ritually unclean during that 40-day period. So she would then come to the temple, make an offering, in Mary and Joseph's case, the poor person's offering of 2 turtle doves to the priest. And so the name for that feast day on the 40th day after Christmas became the purification of the Blessed Virgin Mary. It was still called that in our 1928 American Book of Common Prayer. And the emphasis was on Mary's obedience to Jewish law. The service of thanksgiving of women after childbirth, which was commonly called in English-speaking countries for hundreds of years, the churching of women, was also in all our historic Anglican prayer books. Although the focus changed, it came to be on giving thanks to God for coming through the ordeal of childbirth safely, and on blessing the mother, rather than the Old Testament idea of purification. In some Eastern churches, the feast day has always been called the meeting of Christ with Simeon. And Simeon, of course, was the old man at the temple who had been promised by God that he would not die until he had seen the Messiah. And he recognized Jesus as the Messiah when his parents brought him to the temple to make their offering. And Simeon is the source of the canticle we use both at evening prayer in Roman Catholic Vespers and at Compline, not at Vespers. Compline, the Nunc Dimittis, Lord, now lettest thou thy servant depart in peace, according to thy word. For mine eyes have seen thy salvation, which thou hast prepared before the face of all people, to be a light to enlighten the Gentiles, and to be the glory of thy people Israel. So the return of light, the return of the sun, at this time of year was used by the early church to symbolize the image of Christ as the light of the world, and Simeon's recognition of that fact 40 days after Christmas Day. It was in English-speaking countries that the feast day became known as Candlemas, informally as Candlemas. That wasn't the formal name of it, but that's what everyone called it. after the custom of blessing all the candles for use during the church year were blessed at that Mass. And if you carried home a lighted and blessed candle from this service, it would drive the devil from your house, and it could miraculously heal people. There are tons and tons of medieval stories and legends about miracles associated with that practice. So we do this. We bless candles before the Mass on the Feast of the Presentation. And when we do that, as the candles are being lit, we sing a little bit of the Nunc Dimittis. A light to enlighten the Gentiles, and the glory of thy people Israel. A light to enlighten the Gentiles, or in Latin, which is what that's based on Latin chant, it was Lumen ad revelationem gentium. Lumen, light, ad revelationem, literally, I suppose, for revelation to the Gentiles, and the glory of thy people Israel. And what Tournemire does, Charles Tournemire, who wrote a whole cycle in the 1930s of organ pieces for use during the Mass based on the Gregorian chants of the Mass, uses that chant, and that's the piece I'm going to play in a minute, that Lumen ad revelationem. And the first thing he does with it at the beginning is to play it in half notes, slow the melody down. Goes. And so on. And he harmonizes it as if it were a chorale. And slow on, so the melody is with harmony underneath. And then as he goes on through this piece, he keeps, because the melody, he slowed down the melody, he's able to do a lot of decoration underneath it. He generally keeps that tune pretty close to the top of the keyboard in the right hand. Here it is in F major. It's the same tune. I won't try to sing it in that key. And he adds decoration underneath it. This little figure. And he puts them together. And he adds some rather impressionistic chords underneath it. So that's an example of the kind of thing he does. The decoration underneath the tune, underneath the melody, gets increasingly frilly, increasingly elaborate as it goes on in the piece. Here's the same tune a little later in A major now. In the left hand, he adds this little figure. Just decoration. And then in the right hand, he adds even quicker notes. Then he puts all three of those layers together. The tune is still being played mostly by my little finger in the right hand. And so that's how he builds the piece up. That's one way. This piece is called a diptyque for the Feast of the Purification of Mary. And that's partly because he also uses another chant. And that chant would have been sung just after the Lumen ad revelatio gentium, as people are processing into the church with their lit candles right before the beginning of Mass. And that chant is called Adorna Talamum Tuum. Adorna Talamum Tuum Zion. And the text is deck or adorn your bridal chamber, O Zion, and receive Christ the King. Embrace Mary, the gateway to heaven, for she bears the King of glory and of new light, holding within her hands a son begotten before the morning star. Simeon, taking him into his arms, declared to the nations that he is the Lord of life and of death, the Savior of the world. It's a long chant. Choirmaster doesn't use all of it, but each time you hear that beginning of it, Adorna, begins with a 3-note triad and then goes up. That's that chant. So he weaves those two chants together to form this diptyque for Candlemas, which I'll play now. I should mention that one of the interesting things about this piece is how high it is. Most of the time my hands are in the top 2 octaves of the keyboard. And while the piece does get loud in the middle, it doesn't get all that loud. And he specifically says to avoid heavy 16-foot pedal stops and the loud reeds. There's an atmosphere of light that seems to pervade this piece that I think he captures very effectively by the way he intends the organ to be used, the texture staying high, and even when the texture is thick, it's somehow not heavy. There isn't that much bass used in the piece at all, particularly in the pedals. And that's one of the things that I think gives the piece its atmosphere.